Charles McCullough was a 19-year-old aspiring professional photographer from Virginia who set out in 1974 on an ambitious cross-country trip. His goal was to visit national parks and capture wilderness landscapes through his lens, reflecting his dedication to photography and adventure. Friends and family described him as responsible. He kept in regular contact during his travels and provided itineraries for his planned excursions. By January 1975, McCullough had made his way to Eugene, Oregon, where he stayed with a friend while planning a short winter trip to Crater Lake National Park. On January 29, 1975, Charles departed from his friend's apartment in Eugene and headed toward Crater Lake. He told his friend that he expected to return by January 31st, and that if he wasn't back by February 1st, he should be reported missing. Equipped with his camera, an orange backpack, and winter clothing, Charles boarded a Greyhound bus heading in the direction of the park. The next day, January 30th, several people reported seeing McCullough in the Diamond Lake area, a resort region about 45 minutes from Crater Lake along his route. In fact, a park ranger later noted that he had given a ride to a young man matching McCullough's description from Diamond Lake to the north entrance of Crater Lake on January 30th. This ride made the ranger the last person confirmed to have seen McCullough alive. Conditions in the park at that time were extremely harsh. Heavy snowfall had blanketed the area. Over 5 feet of fresh snow had fallen in the 2 weeks prior, adding a fresh layer of soft powder to already dense snow. The north entrance road McCullough intended to hike was closed for winter, but he likely attempted to follow it on foot or along a snow-covered trail. Unfortunately, a new storm hit shortly after his arrival. Approximately 3 feet of snow fell around the end of January, which would have rapidly buried tracks and made travel by foot even more treacherous. McCullough failed to return to Eugene as planned, and by February 1st, 1975, his worried friend alerted authorities in Eugene that Charles was missing. Upon the missing person report, local law enforcement and park authorities were notified to watch for McCullough. Oregon State Police distributed missing person posters in bus stations around Eugene, initially suspecting that perhaps McCullough had simply altered his travel plans without informing anyone. In the first days, officials had no solid leads. The winter weather severely hampered search efforts. Deep snow made ground searches in the park nearly impossible in February. Still, initial patrols and overflights were conducted. There was no trace of McCullough in the park's accessible areas, and some investigators wondered if he might have left the area entirely. 2 weeks after Charles went missing, his father, also named Charles, flew out to Oregon to take an active role in the search. The elder Charles was determined to find his son. He coordinated with park rangers and even conducted his own extensive searches, focused on Crater Lake's northern section, near where Charles was last seen. Through the spring and summer of 1975, McCullough's father essentially camped out in the park, organizing search parties and scouring the wilderness for any sign of his son. All the while, Charles's family kept pressing for more action. In frustration, a family member even wrote to U.S. Senator William L. Scott in March 1976, complaining that the FBI would not assist. The FBI had replied that they had no jurisdiction in a routine missing persons case without evidence of kidnapping. After more than a year and a half with no answers, a breakthrough finally came in October 1976. On October 13, 1976, 2 hikers from Texas were navigating the remote west side of Crater Lake National Park. As they were hiking along, they stumbled upon an old, weathered backpack in a secluded boggy canyon. They had assumed that the backpack was merely lost property from some hiker, so they brought it to park rangers the next day, thinking nothing more of it. Inside, rangers found a set of keys, one of which appeared to fit a Volkswagen vehicle, the same make of car owned by Charles. This immediately raised eyebrows. Acting on this clue, park rangers organized a search of the area where the pack was found. On October 14, 1976, a mounted patrol discovered human remains scattered down a steep embankment in the wilderness. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition and had clearly been disturbed by animals and the elements. Rangers found portions of a human skeleton, including a skull and a lower jawbone, as well as a few other bones and personal items near a creek bed. The site was roughly 5 to 6 miles from the nearest road, and about 12 miles, by trail, from the point where Charles had likely set out. To put it simply, this location was located extremely deep inside difficult backcountry terrain. Dental charts for McCullough were already on file from the earlier investigation, and indeed the teeth in the recovered skull matched Charles's dental records, confirming the identity. Investigators from the Oregon State Police joined park officials at the recovery scene to look for any additional evidence or clues to what happened. Notably, some key items were missing. McCullough's wallet and his valuable camera equipment were nowhere to be found. Also absent were larger bones of the arms, legs, and torso, as well as his coat and boots. Further, the remains that were present showed no obvious signs of trauma. After examination, the authorities announced that the probable cause of death was exposure to the elements. With the discovery of Charles McCullough's body, the search ended, but the case was far from closed, as many questions lingered about how he met his end in such an unlikely location. From the outset, park officials leaned toward a tragic accident as the explanation for McCullough's death. The official investigation found no evidence of foul play, though, as I'm about to get to, this would not be without controversy. The scenario proposed was that Charles McCullough got caught in a severe winter situation and succumbed to hypothermia or related natural causes while trying to find his way back. This theory is supported by several facts. He was not equipped for overnight survival in deep snow, and he had no snowshoes or similar equipment. Under such conditions, it would have been easy for a lone hiker to become exhausted, disoriented, and overwhelmed by exposure. Rangers noted that hypothermia can induce paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where a freezing victim irrationally feels overheated and removes clothing. This could explain why McCullough's pants were found unbuckled and why his jacket or shirt were never located. Scavenging by wildlife over many months could account for the scattered and incomplete remains. In short, the official view was that Charles McCullough likely perished in a snowstorm, and his body naturally deteriorated in the wild. However, McCullough's family, and some outside observers, have questioned the official narrative, proposing alternative theories. Charles's father never believed that his son's death was simply a mishap. He pointed to the fact that none of Charles's expensive camera gear or cash was ever recovered as a sign that someone might have robbed and harmed him. Notably, Charles had hitchhiked with expensive camera equipment and money, and some have speculated that he may have been slain and dumped in an extremely remote area. What keeps the disappearance of Charles McCullough an enduring mystery are the aspects of the case that still defy easy explanation. First and foremost is the distance. McCullough's remains were found roughly 12 miles from the trailhead where he likely started. This area is rough backcountry under normal circumstances. However, at the time of his disappearance, this entire area was buried under many feet of snow. Seasoned outdoorsmen assert that it would have been virtually impossible for him to cover that ground on foot in those conditions. As you'll recall, Charles didn't have the necessary equipment to handle that sort of terrain, such as snowshoes or cross-country skis. How Charles managed to end up so far off course, in a canyon so remote that even park rangers rarely went there, remains unknown. Some have speculated that the only way he could have conceivably got to the location is if he was transported by snowmobile. Another unresolved element is the absence of key belongings. Charles McCullough was traveling with high-end camera equipment and personal effects like his wallet and cash. Despite extensive searches after the discovery of his remains, none of those items were ever found. If McCullough simply got lost and died, one would expect to find his camera near his body, yet it was missing. In the end, the disappearance of Charles McCullough in 1975 remains an open-ended case. Officially, his death is attributed to the unforgiving forces of nature in the Oregon backcountry. Unofficially, many still wonder if there was more to the story that we will never know. On November 15, 2015, 82-year-old Tom Messick went missing during a deer hunting trip in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. Messick was part of a hunting party of 7 friends and family members, an outing they did annually for decades. That year, the group chose to hunt near Lily Pond by Brant Lake in the town of Horicon, a spot they hadn't visited before. Due to his age and health, Messick's role was to remain stationary as a watch. He was sitting on a stump near a logging road while younger members of the party walked through the woods to drive deer toward him. They planned to regroup around 2 p.m., but when the others returned to the meeting spot, Messick was nowhere to be found. Messick did have some health limitations. He'd lost one eye in an accident and had poor hearing and heart troubles, but he was a lifelong outdoorsman. He carried a hunting rifle and walkie-talkie that day, and he wore camouflage clothing along with his distinctive red and black plaid hat. When Messick failed to show up at the rendezvous point, his companions searched the area and then contacted authorities that afternoon. Forest rangers arrived by 4:30 p.m. and scoured the woods until midnight, but they found no trace of the missing hunter. In essence, what had been a routine outing had suddenly turned into a baffling wilderness mystery that persists to this day. In the days and weeks that followed, a massive search and rescue operation was launched around Lily Pond to look for any sign of Tom Messick. It became one of the most intensive searches the Adirondacks had seen in years, covering roughly 29 square miles of difficult terrain in northern Warren County. At its peak, more than 300 people were involved in the effort, and search teams utilized a wide range of resources. Specially trained search dogs were deployed to track any scent or clues in the woods. Further, state police helicopters conducted aerial sweeps of the forest, and teams of divers searched Lily Pond and other nearby waterways. Despite the exhaustive search, not a single piece of evidence was discovered. The operation continued for weeks, ultimately lasting around 2 months in some form. Yet it turned up no sign of Messick or any of his belongings. Searchers found no footprints, no clothing, and no other clues to indicate what happened. Rescuers were left baffled by how an elderly man could vanish so completely without a trace. With no leads from the search, the New York State Police took charge of the investigation. Messick's disappearance was classified as an active missing person case, and the State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation pursued any possible leads. Investigators have kept the case open. As one state police investigator noted in a 2023 interview, quote, "Missing persons cases aren't closed until we figure out what happened." The unusual circumstances also drew attention from federal authorities. According to Messick's wife, FBI agents told her that something isn't right about Tom's case, although they didn't share any specific theories. Without evidence, the FBI had no explanation either, highlighting how baffling the situation was even to seasoned investigators. As time went on with no answers, numerous theories and speculation emerged about what might have happened to Tom. One possibility was that Messick succumbed to a medical emergency, such as a heart attack, or became lost and died somewhere completely hidden from view. He might have wandered just far enough off his post that searchers missed him, or perhaps fell into a natural crevice or an abandoned mine shaft that concealed him. Another theory suggests that perhaps Tom encountered an unknown person in the woods or was the victim of an accidental shooting or collision that was then covered up. His wife speculated that an ATV rider might have hit him and, panicking, carried him out of the area. However, law enforcement found no hint of any crime or mishap during their investigation, so this theory remains unsupported by evidence. Personally, despite the lack of any corroborating evidence, I think this is the most sensible theory to explain how he dropped off the face of the earth despite a massive investigation. After all, Tom Messick wasn't exactly in the best physical shape and can't have wandered too far from where he was posted. Perhaps a hunting party accidentally struck him with an ATV or accidentally shot him, and then made efforts to cover up the act. If the cover-up was thorough enough, the fact that the entire scene wasn't closed off immediately and treated as a location where foul play may have occurred may have allowed evidence to spoil. And that's not a knock at the investigators here. They immediately sprung into action and began searching for Tom, clearly believing this was a somewhat standard missing person case. The baffling lack of evidence also fueled more unusual ideas, and Tom Messick's case has become a cornerstone of missing 411 videos on YouTube. These videos generally hypothesize that something otherworldly may have been at play in Tom's disappearance. As evidence for this, one hunting partner reported hearing a strange, unidentifiable noise in the woods around the time Messick vanished. Notably, online investigators have also noted that the FBI informed Tom's wife that something seemed very off about the case. The inference they take from this statement is different from what his wife took out of it. While his wife assumed this referred to foul play, these online investigators took the statement to suggest the possibility of an extraterrestrial encounter. While some have criticized these amateur sleuths' intense focus on an unproven theory, I think it's very important to note that these theories have kept attention on Tom's case. While I personally don't believe we need to resort to any supernatural explanations here, the fact that millions of people have become aware of Tom Messick because of it is a very good thing. As I've said before throughout this series, the best way to keep the authorities investigating a case is to keep as much attention on the case as possible. On a cold January night in 1987, 17-year-old Joe Helt set out with friends in the small town of Ellenville, New York, and was never seen again. Helt was a typical teenager in the Hudson Valley, known for his easygoing nature and love of rock music. He lived with his mother and siblings in Ellenville, a quiet village nestled below the Shawangunk Mountains. On Friday, January 16, 1987, Joe joined dozens of local teens at a popular hangout at the abandoned Mount Cathalia Ski Lodge in the nearby hamlet of Craigsmoor. What began as a night of casual partying would soon turn into one of the region's most enduring mysteries. As the evening wore on at the crumbling ski lodge, Joe Helt spent time mingling with friends. At one point, he got into a heated argument with three acquaintances: 21-year-old J.P. LaForge, 18-year-old Wade Marks, and 16-year-old Kelly Diaz. The conflict grew intense. Witnesses later recalled other partygoers drifting away, fearing the dispute might become physical. Despite this tension, Joe eventually left the party with those same three people he had been in conflict with, climbing into LaForge's Subaru for a late-night drive. The group decided to head up a mountain road toward Sam's Point, an area of Minnewaska State Park known for its icy caves and rugged terrain. In the early morning hours of January 17th, their car became stuck in deep snow along a loop road by Lake Maritanza near the Sam's Point Preserve Gatehouse. The three friends later told police that around 3:30 a.m., Joe grew frustrated by their failed attempts to free the car and declared he would walk home. Ellenville was about 5 miles down the mountain, a long trek on a winter night for Joe, who wasn't wearing proper gear. According to the three friends, Joe set off alone into the darkness while they stayed behind. About 20 minutes later, Wade Marks and Kelly Diaz abandoned the stranded car as well, walking in the same direction to Marks's house roughly 2 miles away. John LaForge told investigators he waited another 10 minutes by himself before also trudging off to his home about 1.5 miles from the scene. It was below freezing, the middle of the night, and the mountain was silent and dark. All three made it safely back to their respective homes. Joe Helt, however, never made it off the mountain, and he vanished into the frigid wilderness, leaving no trace behind. When Joe failed to show up for work the next evening, his family realized something was wrong. Joe's mother, Lee Ann, had assumed he'd stayed over with friends after the party, but when his employer called saying Joe hadn't arrived for his shift, panic set in. Joe wasn't the sort of teenager who simply wouldn't show up for work. The Ellenville police were notified on January 17th that the teen was missing, and a massive search effort was launched that very night. State police, forest rangers, local police officers, volunteer firefighters, tracking dogs, and even a helicopter crew mobilized to scour the mountainous area. For 6 days they combed the wilderness, focusing on the rocky trails, caves, and wooded ravines near the spot where Joe was last seen. It wasn't long, however, before nature made the search even more difficult. A heavy winter storm swept into the region that weekend, dumping over 2 feet of snow across the area. Blinding blizzards and snowdrifts impeded progress and raised fears that Joe, if lost and injured, couldn't have survived long in the elements. After nearly a week of fruitless effort, with roads becoming impassable, officials had to suspend the active search. When spring arrived and the snow melted, search teams returned to canvass the mountain again, hoping to find any sign of Joe, but nothing ever turned up. In the investigation that followed, police questioned the 3 friends who were last with Joe. Initially, LaForge, Marks, and Diaz were considered persons of interest, and rumors swirled in the local community about what might have happened on that mountain road. Yet law enforcement could find no hard evidence of foul play. The 3 young friends claimed Joe simply walked off into the night, and no one reported witnessing any crime. Simply put, there was no proof that any crime whatsoever had even occurred. With no body, no witnesses beyond the 3, and no physical clues, Joe's case languished. From early on, there were 2 leading theories about what happened to Joseph Helt: a tragic accident amid hazardous conditions, or foul play at the hands of the people he was with. The accident hypothesis suggests that Joe, disoriented on a frigid night, may have stumbled into the unforgiving terrain of the region. The landscape atop the Shawangunk Ridge is treacherous, dotted with crevices, caves, and steep cliffs hidden by brush, and in winter, often obscured by snow and ice. A popular idea is that Joe could have slipped into one of the deep ice caves, or fallen from a ledge while trying to find his way home. If he succumbed to hypothermia or an injury in a remote crag before the snowstorm, his body might have been quickly buried by snowfall and hidden from rescuers. It's worth noting that Lake Maritanza, the high-elevation lake near where the car was stuck, was frozen at the time. This raises the possibility that Joe fell through ice, though no evidence ever indicated this. However, a second, more sinister theory has persisted, that Joe Helt met with foul play that night. Suspicion has long swirled around the 3 companions who were with him in the car. The fact that Joe had argued with LaForge, Marks, and Diaz at the party raised red flags for his family and friends. Some have suggested that conflict could have reignited after they drove off together, leading to a confrontation on the snowy mountain road. That said, ultimately, there's nothing to support this scenario, and it remains entirely speculative. A summer rescue mission high in the mountains of Hokkaido was supposed to be routine, but what the helicopter crew found that day was anything but ordinary. As the chopper skimmed over the Daisetsuzan National Park on July 24, 1989, searching for two missing hikers, the pilot spotted something astonishing on the ground below. It was giant white letters spelling out SOS in the middle of the green wilderness. The makeshift distress signal had been formed by birch tree trunks, each about 15 feet long, arranged to catch the eye of anyone flying overhead. The crew zeroed in and soon located the lost hikers, two men from Tokyo, a couple miles north of the mysterious sign. Relieved, the rescuers whisked the pair to safety, assuming the improvised SOS had been the handiwork of these very hikers. But as the helicopter team went over the site and congratulated them on their clever signal, the two men exchanged baffled looks. They hadn't made any sign at all. In that moment, a routine rescue transformed into the start of one of Japan's most perplexing wilderness mysteries. The revelation sent a chill through the Hokkaido authorities. If the enormous SOS wasn't made by the rescued hikers, then who had put it there? The search team suddenly realized there might be another stranded person out there. Someone who had painstakingly arranged 19 birch logs into a desperate plea for help and never lived to see rescue. Due to fading daylight on the 24th, authorities had to wait until the next morning to investigate the area around the sign. On July 25th, a second search party returned to the remote mountainside to scour for clues near the giant letters. The sign lay on a marshy slope about 2 miles from Mount Asahidake's summit, not far from the headwaters of the Chubetsu River. It wouldn't take long for them to discover that the silent symbol was indeed the harbinger of a tragedy. Scattered bones were soon found strewn near the wooden sign, confirming the team's worst fears. The skeletal remains had been disturbed by animals, with bite marks on many of the fragments. More eerily, investigators noted that some bones were broken in ways suggesting the person had suffered serious injuries before death, possibly from a fall in the treacherous terrain. As the search expanded, police made another grim find. A small hole or crevice in the ground, just large enough for a person to huddle inside, containing an abandoned backpack and assorted personal items. This hidden cache was like a time capsule from the past. Inside the pack were items that hinted at the identity and fate of the mystery victim. There were 2 cameras, a tripod, a notebook, a pair of men's basketball shoes, a couple of toothbrushes with toothpaste, and a portable tape recorder with 4 cassette tapes. Perhaps most crucially, there was also a driver's license. The name on the ID was Kenji Iwamura, a 25-year-old man from the city of Konan in Japan's Aichi Prefecture. The discovery of Kenji Iwamura's belongings brought a sense of clarity to the situation. Police now had a probable name for the deceased camper. Kenji had gone missing 5 years earlier, in the summer of 1984. Back on July 10, 1984, Kenji, an office worker and avid outdoorsman, had set off alone on a hiking trip to Mount Asahidake, part of the same national park where the SOS sign now lay. He was reportedly taking a week off after a job promotion to explore the scenic Hokkaido wilderness. Before heading into the mountains, Kenji checked in at a local lodge near the trail. Staff later recalled warning him that the weather was turning foul and the route could be dangerous, advising him to wait for better conditions. But the young hiker was eager and undeterred. He departed for the climb despite the cautions, aiming to reach the summit against all odds. When Kenji failed to come back to the lodge or show up at work the next week, a missing person report was filed, and local police conducted searches in 1984. At the time, they found no trace of him in the vast expanse of forested peaks. Kenji Iwamura seemed to have vanished into thin air. Now, 5 years later in 1989, It appeared that his final message had literally been spelled out on the mountainside, tragically unnoticed for years. The giant SOS sign spotted by chance in the helicopter search had likely been built during Kenji's ill-fated excursion and stood as a silent witness to his plight. Indeed, when authorities consulted old aerial photographs of the area, they discovered that the huge SOS had been visible in images dating back to at least September 1987. For at least 2 years prior to its 1989 rediscovery, the sign, and possibly Kenji's remains, lay hidden in plain sight, undetected by other hikers or rangers. And yeah, you may have noticed I said possibly. This is where things start getting really weird. With Kenji's ID and gear now in hand, investigators initially assumed the recovered bones were his. However, this case was about to take another bewildering turn. The skeletal remains were sent to Asahikawa Medical University for analysis, and the first reports came back with a shocker. The bones appeared to belong to a woman, approximately 20 to 40 years old. Kenji was male, so this finding raised troubling questions. Did another person die alongside Kenji Iwamura? The media latched onto the idea that an unidentified woman had perished there, fueling wild theories. Yet there were no reports of a missing female hiker in the area, and everyone who knew Kenji insisted he had gone hiking alone. Faced with these perplexing findings, authorities turned their attention to the tapes recovered from Kenji's backpack. Perhaps they could shed light on what happened in those final moments on the mountain. On July 27, 1989, a police team played the 4 cassettes, not knowing what they would hear. 3 of the tapes contained nothing unusual. They were filled with music, notably theme songs from popular 1980s anime TV shows. It later came out that Kenji was something of an otaku and had carried those tapes with him on the hike. But it was the 4th tape that turned the investigation on its head. This cassette held a 2-minute and 17-second recording of a voice, a young man, shouting in panicked Japanese. In the crackling audio, he's yelling SOS and begging for help over and over. He frantically explains that he's stuck on top of a cliff and cannot move. The voice is strained, desperate, and echoing with the hopelessness of someone who truly believes these might be his last words. Hardened police officers listening to the tape were haunted by the sheer desperation in those recorded shouts. It was as if Kenji Iwamura had used the last of his strength to make an audio message in hopes that rescuers might find it. Yet, the method was puzzling. A tape recorder is not a transmitter, so why record a plea for help that no one would hear in time? One theory was that Kenji had intended to use the recording in lieu of his voice if searchers came near. He planned to use it if he grew too weak to shout, or maybe he did it just to leave it behind as a metaphorical message in a bottle. Another possibility is that he simply left the recorder running by accident, and it captured his final cries without him realizing. To this day, we don't know for sure. The only thing certain is that the tape preserved a chilling moment in time, a young man alone on a mountainside, calling out for salvation that would not arrive in time. Interestingly, when police played the tape for Kenji Iwamura's parents later on, the grieving family couldn't conclusively identify the voice as their son's. It's possible the agony and exhaustion had distorted his voice beyond recognition, or perhaps the voice might belong to someone else entirely. The tape's existence and the parents' doubt opened the door to yet more speculation. By early 1990, the case of the SOS sign had advanced somewhat, but many mysteries remained unsolved. After re-examining the bone fragments, authorities corrected their earlier mistake and concluded that all the remains belonged to one person. Further, despite the earlier confusion, that person was male, and in February 1990, the police formally announced that the skeleton was now believed to be Kenji Iwamura. Yet, if Kenji Iwamura died there in 1984, critical questions lingered. How had a lone, injured man built an SOS sign of such magnitude? And if he didn't build it alone, who helped him? The wooden letters on that slope were enormous. Each letter was roughly 10 to 16 feet across, composed of multiple heavy birch logs stacked 3 high. Analysis by forestry experts estimated it would take a strong, able-bodied person at least 2 days of hard labor to assemble such a sign with the available timber. Kenji, however, was described in the autopsy as having a slight, thin build, so much so that the authorities had initially very confidently misgendered his remains. Simply put, Kenji was no strapping Japanese woodsman by any stretch of the imagination. Further, the injuries to his skeleton suggest he had broken bones that would have left him weak or immobilized before he died. Building the huge SOS under those conditions would verge on the impossible, unless he had injured himself in the process of making the sign. Furthermore, no axe or saw was ever found at the site, while the logs could have been deadfall, already fallen trees. Arranging them so neatly likely required cutting tools, or at least tremendous effort to drag and position. So how then did the SOS sign come to be? One leading theory suggests that Kenji Iwamura may not have been completely alone during his ordeal. Perhaps he crossed paths with another lost hiker on the mountain. In this scenario, after Kenji fell and injured himself, explaining the fractures in his remains, the other person tried and failed to carry him out of the ravine. Kenji, unable to walk, might have urged this companion to go find help. Before leaving, the unknown helper could have gathered birch logs to create a massive signal nearby, hoping it would lead rescuers to Kenji. The theory continues that the companion then set off to seek rescue but never made it, perhaps falling victim to the elements as well, or turning back after getting lost. If this hypothetical Good Samaritan perished or failed to inform authorities, it would explain why no one ever came for Kenji. The Hokkaido police themselves considered this two-person theory as a strong possibility. It neatly accounts for the scale of the sign and the absence of a cutting tool. A healthier, strapping Kintaro type of fella could have done the heavy lifting and chopping. It also might explain why Kenji's family didn't recognize the voice on the tape. Conceivably, it could have been the other man's voice on the recording. However, this theory has one glaring hole. No evidence of a second person was ever found. No extra set of belongings, no second skeleton, no additional names in lodge logs or missing persons reports. Despite being plausible, it remains purely speculative. On the other hand, perhaps the simplest explanation is closer to the truth. Kenji Iwamura may have been more resourceful and determined than anyone guessed. Despite his injuries, maybe he did manage to slowly drag and stack logs into an SOS sign over many agonizing days, driven by sheer will to survive. Human beings in life or death situations have accomplished incredible feats of endurance and strength. In this version, everything at the site was essentially his doing, a solo struggle against nature with a tragic ending. Officially, the case was closed with the conclusion that Kenji was alone and died due to an accident in the wilderness. Yet even the police admitted that some aspects would forever remain unanswered. And remember how this story started out? Well, in a bittersweet twist of fate, his SOS sign did save lives, just not his own. 5 years after Kenji disappeared, that weathered SOS ended up leading rescuers to 2 lost hikers, bringing them home safely. This final act of desperation thus became an unintended beacon of hope for others. A disposable camera found on a lonely mountain trail held a haunting secret. Its final photograph, snapped in darkness, revealed only a boy's frightened eyes and nose. This eerie self-portrait is the last trace of 12-year-old Jared Negrete, who vanished during a Boy Scout hike in 1991. His disappearance has baffled searchers for decades and remains one of Southern California's most unsettling wilderness mysteries. In July 1991, Jared Negrete, a shy but friendly 12-year-old from El Monte, went on his first overnight Boy Scout camping trip. The journey began on July 18th with the troop camping overnight. By the next day, as they pushed toward the 11,500-foot summit, Jared struggled to keep up on the steep switchback trails, and he eventually fell behind the others. Rather than halt the group's progress, the troop leader decided the faster hikers would continue to the summit and pick up Jared on their way back down. Thus, Jared was left walking at his own pace, alone on the mountainside as evening neared. This is, of course, an extremely questionable and disturbing decision in and of itself, having the leader of the expedition leaving behind one of the most vulnerable members. In hindsight, if this hadn't have happened, this nightmare would have almost certainly been avoided. Some hikers later reported seeing the lone boy cutting straight down the switchbacks, and they urged him to stay on the marked trail. In fact, around 6 o'clock, one off-duty firefighter hiking through encountered Jared and warned him not to stray off route, and that was the last confirmed sighting of the boy. When the troop regrouped on the descent that night, Jared was nowhere to be found. Alarmed, the leader led the other boys back to base camp and then hiked down the mountain in darkness to summon help. By the time authorities were notified, Jared had already been missing for several hours in the vast wilderness. At first light on July 20th, 1991, an intensive search and rescue operation was launched. Teams of rescuers scoured the mountainside on foot and horseback, while helicopters swept the area from above. Rescuers came from across Southern California, and they searched day and night in rotating shifts. The terrain was unforgiving. Loose rocks, slippery slopes, and dense brush made every step perilous. Mount San Gorgonio's wilderness is a maze of rocky crags and sandy switchbacks, with many trails that lead to nowhere, making navigation difficult even for experienced hikers. Off the established paths, one can easily be swept into a ravine or end up obscured by thick vegetation in this treacherous region. Despite the dangers, officials held on to hope because summer weather was mild and fresh water was available from streams. Within 2 days, searchers found their first clues. On July 21st, footprints believed to match Jared's sneakers were spotted around the 10,000-foot level of the mountain. This discovery helped narrow the focus to a specific zone of the wilderness. Shortly afterward, search teams discovered pieces of beef jerky and some candy wrappers likely dropped by Jared during his hike. A week into the effort, on July 27th, the most significant find was made: Jared's disposable Kodak camera, lying about 50 feet off the Vivian Creek Trail. When the film was developed, investigators found 12 photos. Most were scenic shots taken before Jared went missing, but the final frame was a startling enigma. It was a blurry, extreme close-up of Jared's face, just his eyes and nose, taken at night with the camera's flash. At some point after his disappearance, the boy had pointed the camera at himself and snapped a picture in the dark. Family members who later saw this last photo believed that Jared looked frightened in it, giving a chilling glimpse of his ordeal on the mountainside. With these clues in hand, authorities concentrated their efforts below the spot where Jared was last seen. Dozens of searchers combed through creek beds, thickets, and rocky drop-offs in that area inch by inch. At one point, a blue water bottle was found and briefly raised hopes, but it was confirmed not to have belonged to Jared. Over the next 2 weeks, The operation grew into the largest search in San Bernardino County history. As many as 3,000 people in total participated, covering up to 50 square miles of wilderness in their exhaustive hunt. Volunteers, sheriff's deputies, forest rangers, and National Guard troops all joined forces in the massive effort. Jared's mother, Linda, hiked into the search area alongside authorities, determined to help find any sign of her son. Yet, despite clear weather and an all-out push, not a single additional trace of the boy emerged. After 16 days of exhaustive searching, officials made the painful decision to call off the official search on August 4th, 1991. By then, the chance of finding Jared alive was deemed virtually zero, and authorities had to presume the boy had perished. Veteran rescuers remarked in contemporary interviews with the LA Times that hikers often get lost in these mountains, but rarely do they disappear without a trace. In Jared's case, sadly, that is exactly what happened. He was simply gone, leaving his family and searchers with nothing to do but wonder how and why. In the absence of a definitive answer, several theories have been put forward to explain his disappearance. Investigators and family members have pondered these possibilities, but without new evidence, none can be confirmed. The most widely accepted theory is that Jared fell victim to the mountain's perilous terrain. All signs suggest he left the main trail and ventured into an unsafe area while trying to find his way down alone. If he slipped on loose rocks or stepped over a ledge in the fading light, he could have tumbled into a hidden ravine or crag. From there, the dense brush and jagged terrain might easily have concealed him from rescuers. The wilderness has many sheer cliffs and deep gullies blanketed with vegetation, and searchers noted that a person could quickly become invisible if they wandered off the path. Some involved in the search speculated that Jared appeared to have attempted continued shortcutting down the switchbacks until he ended up below the established trail. This would have involved descending into a difficult canyon, which was the same canyon where his camera and candy wrappers were found. Under such conditions, it's very plausible that Jared fell or became injured and couldn't climb out. The fact that no remains or clothing were ever found is unsettling, but it could be due to the vastness of the area and how thoroughly nature can hide a body. This accidental misadventure scenario remains the leading explanation in the eyes of those who have studied the case. Another angle considered whether someone else could have been involved in Jared's fate. From the start, investigators found no evidence of human interference, and there were no signs of a struggle, no suspicious footprints or items, and no eyewitness reports. While not entirely impossible, an abduction in that remote setting would have been difficult to pull off without alerting other hikers nearby. However, one theory suggested that perhaps Jared wandered down to a road and was picked up by an unknown individual, essentially kidnapped after surviving the initial night. This idea was investigated, but authorities eventually largely dismissed it for lack of any corroborating clues or sightings. In the end, nothing concrete ever emerged to point toward foul play. Law enforcement's consensus has long been that Jared's disappearance was most likely a tragic accident, not the work of another person. That said, while the authorities view this as a very unlikely scenario, it remains a potential possibility. Notably, because the region is home to wildlife like black bears and mountain lions, the possibility of an animal attack was also examined. However, this theory was quickly deemed unlikely. Search teams found no evidence to indicate a bear or cougar had attacked and dragged Jared away. Encounters with large predators are rare, and they almost always leave obvious signs when they do occur. Since absolutely no such traces were found during the extensive search, the wildlife theory holds little weight compared to other explanations. Jared's disappearance devastated his family and community. In September 1991, after hope of finding him alive had faded, the family held a memorial service in his honor. To this day, no trace of Jared Negrete has ever been recovered, and the case remains cold, despite being periodically re-examined by the authorities. And yeah, just before we move on, this story is incredibly messed up, because there's absolutely no reason this should have happened to Jared. And I don't say that to imply that bad things should happen to anyone I'm covering, but to say that this tragedy was both 100% preventable and also completely foreseeable. Leaving behind the least physically capable member of the hike just so you can reach the summit is incredibly messed up, to say the least. In the spring of 2007, a seasoned adventurer set out into the wilds of northern Arizona and never came back. Reinhard Kirchner was a 61-year-old physicist from Germany who loved exploring the rugged landscapes of the American Southwest. An experienced hiker in excellent shape, he had journeyed to the United States many times to trek through its deserts and canyons. This trip was supposed to be another grand adventure, but instead, it became a haunting mystery. Kirchner ventured into a remote area of the Navajo Reservation, a place of deep canyons, hidden sinkholes, and unforgiving terrain, and simply vanished without a trace. Reinhard Kirchner wasn't a novice in the wilderness. Back home in Germany, he had a distinguished career as a physicist, but his passion for adventure often drew him overseas. He had fallen in love with the dramatic geology of Arizona's Colorado Plateau, returning again and again to hike its trails and photograph its vistas. Friends and family knew him as a fit, careful, and well-prepared outdoorsman. By 2007, he had extensive experience in desert hiking and canyon exploration, and he even knew this particular region well from prior visits. Kirchner's personal life was also in a good place. He was engaged to be married and was planning to meet his fiancée in Las Vegas after his hiking trip. That rendezvous was set for April 9th, 2007, but unfortunately, he would never make it to that meeting. In early April 2007, Kirchner drove his rented pickup truck deep into a remote section of the Navajo wilderness in northeastern Arizona. He was heading for an area near a dramatic bend of the Little Colorado River, known as Hellhole Bend. This region of the Colorado Plateau is characterized by sheer cliffs that plummet into a 2,500-foot gorge and a landscape riddled with hidden sinkholes. In fact, Hellhole Bend earned its ominous name from the abundance of these hellish sinkhole pits in the ground. It is the kind of place only the most adventurous hikers would go, and Kirchner was certainly one of them. He parked his truck near the canyon's rim and set off on foot, likely for a day hike. When April 9th came and Kirchner failed to show up in Las Vegas to meet his fiancée, alarm bells rang. At first, those close to him wondered if he might have been delayed or out of cell phone range, but as the days passed with no word, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Kirchner was reliable and kept to his plans, and for him to miss that meeting without any contact meant he was in trouble. His fiancée reported him missing, and authorities sprang into action. On April 12, 2007, searchers located Kirchner's abandoned rental truck near the rim of the Little Colorado River Gorge, about 2 miles from Hellhole. The truck sat on a lonely dirt track by the canyon, a silent marker of where he had begun his trek. There were no signs of foul play or any potential theft at the site, and it appeared that Kirchner had simply walked off into the wild and never come back. Finding Kirchner's truck triggered an intensive multi-agency search effort across jurisdictional lines, with both county and tribal authorities joining in. Coconino County Sheriff's search and rescue teams and Navajo Nation officials joined forces to scour the canyon lands by land and air. Helicopters crisscrossed the maze of cliffs and ravines, while ground teams and dog units struggled through the rocky, uneven terrain below. Over 6 days, searchers covered approximately 60 square miles around Hellhole Bend. This was no small feat, as the landscape is formidable at best and extremely problematic at worst. The gorge of the Little Colorado River cuts deep into the plateau, and one misstep near the edge can be deadly. Rescuers had to be extremely cautious not to become victims themselves. One of the biggest hazards in this area, and a possible key to Kirchner's fate, is the presence of numerous limestone sinkholes. These are deep natural pits in the ground, often concealed by desert scrub and hard to see until it's too late. Especially after dusk, it's perilously easy to stumble into one of these chasms without warning. Search coordinators noted that many of the sinkholes near Hellhole Bend were too dangerous to enter, so they lowered cameras in hopes of spotting any trace of the missing man. Despite these efforts, the search turned up nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, not the hiking stick or camera that Kirchner was known to carry. After nearly a week of exhaustive effort, the official search was reluctantly called off with no evidence found. With no solid evidence to go on, those involved in the case have been left to speculate how an experienced hiker could disappear so completely. The leading theory is that Kirchner suffered an accident in the wilderness. Given the known dangers in the area, many believe he likely fell into a hidden sinkhole or over a cliff near the canyon rim. A fall from such heights or into a deep pit would be catastrophic, and it might explain why searchers found no remains. If Kirchner's body ended up at the bottom of an unseen chasm, it could remain undiscovered despite all the search efforts. The area is so remote and seldom visited that it's possible no one has yet come across any sign of him. Another possibility is that Kirchner became lost or injured and eventually succumbed to the elements. April nights in this high desert are deceptively cold, and the days can be extremely hot. A dangerous combination if you're stranded without shelter or water. Kirchner had only a day pack with him and was not equipped for a long ordeal in the wild. If he wandered beyond the initial search zone or got trapped in one of the side canyons, he might have been missed. Still, the complete lack of clues, such as a campsite or gear, makes this scenario less convincing. Foul play is an unlikely scenario but can't be entirely ruled out. The location is extremely isolated, and encountering a wrongdoer out there would be rare. Investigators found no evidence pointing to robbery or violence. His vehicle and belongings were undisturbed. All signs point more toward a tragic mishap than a crime in this case. Although investigators view Reinhard Kirchner's fate as a tragic hiking accident, some in the public have speculated about whether his disappearance is related to his profession. Kirchner was a physicist in Germany, a field that often involves sensitive research projects. While there's no evidence suggesting that he was working on classified or high-security projects, the mystery of his vanishing has encouraged such theories. Some suggest he could have been silenced because of knowledge he possessed. Others have proposed that he may have chosen to disappear deliberately to escape professional pressures. It's really important here to emphasize that these ideas remain highly speculative, with no proof connecting his physics career to his disappearance in Arizona. Still, the combination of his scientific expertise and the total lack of physical evidence has allowed these theories to persist in discussions of his case. While Reinhard Kirchner's disappearance is clearly both tragic and sad, I don't see it as a particularly dark tale like some have suggested. The most consistent and credible explanation for Kirchner's disappearance aligns with the official narrative: a tragic accident in an unforgiving landscape. Search teams noted the prevalence of those hidden sinkholes and sheer cliffs near Hellhole Bend, any of which could have claimed his life in an instant. With no signs of foul play and no evidence suggesting an intentional disappearance, the simplest answer is also the most logical. Kirchner was a seasoned outdoorsman, which some have used to argue that the case could be much darker, but even experts can be overwhelmed by the hazards of remote terrain. His case essentially illustrates how nature's unpredictability can overcome preparation and experience, especially in truly unforgiving terrain. On a frigid February night in 1984, high on Alaska's Mount Denali, also known as Mount McKinley, one of the world's greatest adventurers of the 20th century, vanished without a trace. Naomi Omura had just achieved an astonishing feat, completing the first solo winter ascent of Denali, but he would never return to tell the tale. The day after his historic summit, amid howling winds and -50-degree temperatures, Omura disappeared into the mountain's icy expanse. His mysterious fate has captivated the world for decades, sparking both awe at his accomplishment and sorrow at the tragedy that followed. Naomi Omura was no ordinary climber, and he had racked up solo exploits that had already made him a legend. He was the first person to reach the North Pole alone, the first to raft the Amazon River solo, and in 1970 the first to summit Denali solo in summer. In fact, by age 29, he had climbed 5 of the 7 summits, a record that highlighted his prodigious endurance and skill. This soft-spoken, unassuming man carried an iron will and a taste for adventures once deemed impossible. By 1984, Omura had set his sights on a new milestone, a solo winter ascent of Denali. At just over 20,000 feet, Denali is North America's highest peak, infamous for brutal weather and extreme cold. Climbing it in summer is challenging enough, but in winter, it's downright perilous. And it wasn't summited in this season until 1967. And just to put things in perspective further, no climber had ever attempted Denali solo in the winter until Omura came along. Omura prepared meticulously for the brutal conditions. He knew glacier crevices, often hidden under snow, posed a persistent threat. To guard against a fall into one of these glacial nightmares, he devised a heart-stopping self-rescue system that sounds absolutely insane. He had bamboo poles strapped across his shoulders that could catch on the edges and help pull him out after he fell into these wintry pits. Embracing a fast and light approach to mountaineering, he carried only about 40 pounds of gear, plus a sled. In an effort to keep his gear to a minimum, he didn't even pack a tent. He planned to sleep in snow caves instead, and brought very limited fuel for cooking, accepting that most of his meals would be ice cold to save weight. Every ounce saved made him faster, which was crucial when racing against short winter daylight and frequent storms. On February 1st, 1984, Naomi Omura set out from the Kahilna Glacier Base Camp alone. Over the next 10 days, bush pilots occasionally flew by to monitor his progress from afar. They watched as he steadily ascended Denali's West Buttress route, but were ultimately powerless to do anything if they noticed trouble. The climb was grueling, with waist-deep snow in parts and steep ice slopes, and with temperatures so low that exposed skin could freeze in seconds. Despite periodic storms blasting the higher elevations, Omura methodically worked his way upward, caching some supplies along the route to lighten his load. He passed the 14,000-foot mark and climbed into the mountain's thin-aired upper reaches, inching closer to his goal with each step. February 12, 1984, brought a brief window of clearer weather, and it happened to be Omura's 43rd birthday. That afternoon, a pilot spotted him only a few hundred feet below the summit. Omura radioed that he expected to reach the top by 4 that afternoon, but progress was slow at that altitude. When the plane crew looked again at 4, he was still climbing and had not yet arrived at the summit. Darkness fell soon after, and observers lost sight of him as the mountain was engulfed in night and cloud. Incredibly, Omura did reach Denali's summit that evening, planting the Japanese flag on the top of this great mountain, all while he was alone in the dark. In a brief radio call the next morning, he reported that he had stood on the top of Denali the night before, achieving his seemingly impossible goal. During this call, he mentioned that he then descended for a few hours to a camp, though he didn't specify where it was. He sounded exhausted, but said he was okay, and told his support crew to expect him back at base camp by February 15th. Unfortunately, that would be the last time anyone ever heard his voice. After that morning radio contact, Omura continued his descent, but the weather took a sharp turn. A fierce storm swept over Denali on February 13th, bringing howling winds and bitter cold. The mountain was soon fully shrouded in whiteout blizzard conditions. Planes attempted to fly over on the 13th and 14th, but saw nothing through the clouds and blowing snow. By February 15th, the day Omura was due out, concern was growing. A veteran pilot, Doug Geating, flew to the base camp to pick up Omura, only to find the camp empty. Geating searched the mountain from the air, but saw no sign of the climber on the route. Turbulent winds still battered the upper ridges, so Geating suspected Omura was hunkered down in a snow cave high up, waiting for the storm to blow over. On the morning of February 16th, Geating made another aerial search with a fellow pilot. This time he glimpsed what looked like a person popping out of a snow cave and waving, and he was convinced it was Omura. They had agreed before the climb that if Omura needed rescue, he would make frantic signals, so the calm wave meant he wasn't in critical distress. Relieved by this sighting, officials decided to hold off on a risky rescue attempt. The winds were still far too dangerous for a helicopter to get anywhere near that altitude, and they didn't want to insult Omura's self-reliant ethos by sending a team up prematurely. After all, if they sent a helicopter up to rescue him, his first solo winter summiting would forever be marked with an asterisk. All they could do was wait for the weather to improve, trusting in the climber's extraordinary resilience and ability. Bad weather persisted until February 19th, keeping search aircraft largely grounded. During a brief flyby, pilots spotted Omura's abandoned snowshoes at around 14,000 feet. This is where he had left them on the way up, intending to take them back for his journey down. This find bolstered hope that he was still sheltering somewhere above, enduring on his meager supplies until he could safely continue. At last, on February 20th, the storm finally broke, and his team decided it was time to take drastic action. Search planes immediately scoured the mountain in the clear morning light. They traced the entire route from base camp to summit multiple times, but found no movement, no fresh tracks, no trace of Omura. In such good weather, he should have been visible if he were on the move. The fact that he was absolutely nowhere to be seen was a grim sign. That day, the National Park Service launched a ground search, and a helicopter ferried 2 mountaineers to the 14,000-foot level to look for Omura. They climbed up to about 16,000 feet and discovered a snow cave that Omura had used on his ascent. They even spotted the Japanese flag Omura had planted on the summit in the distance, confirming his historic climb, but of the man himself there was still no sign. Soon after, another heavy storm swept over Denali, frustrating the search once more. Days passed with no further clues, and on February 26th, authorities reluctantly called off the search. Naomi Omura was officially declared missing, presumed deceased, and the mountain had claimed one of history's most daring explorers. The exact circumstances of Omura's demise remain uncertain, but climbers and experts have pieced together likely scenarios. One leading theory is that he fell during his descent. One stretch on the west buttress, a steep wall of ice and snow, is extremely treacherous, especially in winter. A single misstep or a sudden gust could have sent Omura plunging into a glacial pit or over an edge, his body quickly buried by drifting snow. If that happened, it's no surprise the search teams found no trace of him, since there'd be no meaningful way to locate him, let alone recover his body. Another possibility is that Omura succumbed to exposure high on the mountain. He had summited very late and was already exhausted when last heard. It's conceivable he was overtaken by the ferocious cold and wind near Denali Pass, or even closer to the summit before he could get to lower elevation. If he couldn't find or reach a shelter in the whiteout, hypothermia could have set in rapidly. Notably, some have questioned whether the February 16th sighting was real, or if the pilot had fallen for a visual trick. Notably, searchers later found some of Omura's gear around 17,000 feet, near one of his high camps. This suggests he had cached or abandoned equipment to lighten his summit push. In the chaos of descending during the storm, Omura might have missed the cache with his warmer gear and unintentionally passed it. This would have left him with subpar shelter and resources when he needed them most. In that weakened state, even a small incident could have claimed his life. Ultimately, whether by a fall or by extreme weather, Naomi Omura met his end on the icy slopes of Denali. His disappearance shook the climbing community and his nation. In Japan, where he was already a national hero, Omura was posthumously awarded the People's Honor Award for his achievements. To this day, over 4 decades on, Omura's body has never been found. In the early hours of August 26, 2006, an eerie scene awaited at a remote fire lookout cabin in the forests of Alberta in Canada. A pot of water was left boiling on the stove, its owner nowhere to be found. Outside on the wooden steps, investigators noted what appeared to be a smear of blood, a silent testament that something had gone terribly wrong. This was the home of 70-year-old Stephanie Stewart, a veteran wildfire spotter stationed alone atop the Athabasca Lookout Tower near Hinton. That morning, Stephanie had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only unsettling clues and a mystery that has endured for nearly 2 decades. Stephanie Stewart wasn't a typical 70-year-old by any means, and she appears to have been more active than most people in their 20s or 30s. Friends described her as amazingly fit for her age. She had cycled solo across Canada and summited Mount Kilimanjaro in her late 60s. A mother of one and an avid reader and crafter, Stephanie split her year between winter months in Canmore, a city in Alberta, and summers in the wilderness. For 18 seasons, she worked as a wildfire spotter for Alberta's Forestry Service, and for the last 13 of those years, she returned each spring to the same lookout. This was the Athabasca Tower in William Switzer Provincial Park. There, perched on a high ridge, she lived in a small cabin at the base of a 40-foot observation tower. Every day she climbed the tower ladder to scan the rolling foothills and boreal forest for smoke. It was solitary work, and Stephanie was the only human for miles, but she relished it. On the night of August 25, 2006, Stephanie spoke with family by phone around 9 o'clock, and everything seemed normal. By the following morning, however, alarm bells were ringing. Stephanie failed to make her scheduled radio check-in, a mandatory safety call she reliably made each morning at 8:30 to confirm all was well. When repeated calls to her cabin went unanswered, her supervisor grew concerned. The supervisor tried phoning the lookout several times. Strangely, someone did answer, but each time the receiver was picked up, the person on the other end immediately hung up without a word. After a few such attempts, the line went dead entirely, as if the phone had been unplugged mid-ring. This bizarre phone behavior greatly alarmed Stephanie's supervisor, who knew she was always dutiful with communications. Fearing the worst, he drove out to the Athabasca Tower site that morning. Arriving by roughly 9 a.m., the supervisor found an ominous, perplexing scene. Stephanie's pickup truck was still parked outside the cabin, ruling out the possibility that she had driven off. Inside the small dwelling, a pot of water was boiling away on the stove untended, as if Stephanie had stepped out briefly and intended to return at any moment. A quick search of the area found no sign of the woman, and a complete sense of dread overcame the supervisor. Noticing some out-of-place details, the supervisor contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police immediately, and Stephanie was formally reported missing. Investigators processing the cabin soon discovered that a few personal items were missing from Stephanie's quarters. Notably, her bedding, 2 pillows with blue pillowcases, a burgundy bedsheet, and a Navajo pattern duvet were gone, as was Stephanie's gold wristwatch. These items were absent despite no sign of a struggle inside. Outside the cabin, however, a troubling clue turned up. There were traces of blood on the steps of the cabin, and they appeared to be quite fresh. Authorities have never released full details about the blood evidence, but its presence strongly indicated that some violence had occurred at the site. All signs appeared to point to one overwhelming conclusion. Stephanie Stewart was abducted by an unknown person or persons that morning. News of Stephanie's disappearance spread fast, and an enormous search operation was launched in the rugged foothills around the Athabasca Lookout. Search and rescue teams and park rangers, alongside hundreds of volunteers, combed through dense forest, looking for any trace of the missing fire spotter. Helicopters buzzed overhead, and tracking dogs sniffed for clues on the ground. Searchers scoured a radius of several kilometers around the tower, but nothing definitive was found. It became one of the largest search efforts in Alberta's history, yet it turned up painfully little. Notably, investigators treated the site as a potential crime scene from the start, due to the suspicious circumstances surrounding Stephanie's disappearance. They noted the totality of evidence was inconsistent with any voluntary departure. The fact that Stephanie left behind her truck, her keys, and even her morning coffee heating on the stove suggested she had fully intended to remain there for her day's work. Further, the missing bedding suggested that it may have been used to move Stephanie out of the cabin. Unfortunately, despite thorough forensic work, no definitive DNA or fingerprints leading to a suspect were publicly reported. Authorities did state that evidence at the scene convinced them Stephanie had been the victim of a slaying, even though her body was not found. With the case unsolved, various theories have emerged over the years about what might have happened to Stephanie Stewart. Some are grounded in investigative leads, while others are the product of armchair detectives puzzling over the scant evidence. The most widely accepted theory is that an unknown person approached Stephanie's cabin, likely in the early morning, and harmed her in the course of a robbery or assault. Perhaps someone driving along the highway took a detour up to the lookout, either hoping to find valuables or seeking shelter, and encountered Stephanie. The boiling water on the stove hints that she might have invited a visitor inside for tea or coffee, as she often did with guests, not realizing the danger. In this scenario, something turned violent, and the perpetrator hurriedly removed Stephanie before fleeing. The fact that the phone line was abruptly disconnected during the supervisor's calls suggests the intruder was present at 8:30 that morning and panicked when the phone rang. Another variant of this theory suggests that Stephanie actually fell victim to someone she knew. This theory explains why she would have opened her door for this unknown individual. For instance, if a park ranger had knocked on her door, she likely would have had no reason whatsoever not to welcome him in, not knowing what his intent was. That said, this avenue has been pursued. And as far as we are aware, based on information made public, no one in the Park Service is a suspect. Over time, speculation has focused on a few possible suspects, including one particularly notorious name, Travis Vader. Vader is a central figure in a high-profile Alberta criminal case. In 2010, he slew an elderly couple during a robbery, then burned their RV and hid their bodies in the wilderness. Given that Vader targeted senior citizens and was known to be involved in theft and violence, some have wondered if he could have crossed paths with Stephanie in 2006. Investigators noted that Vader was apparently in the vicinity of Hinton around the time Stephanie disappeared, fueling theories of his involvement. However, it's crucial to stress that Vader has never been charged or officially linked to the Stewart case. The Vader theory remains speculative, possibly a case of criminal coincidence, but it highlights the kind of human predator who could have been responsible. Notably, because Stephanie was in the wilderness, some initially wondered if a bear or other large animal could have attacked and dragged her away. This idea was thoroughly investigated and dismissed as the authorities found zero signs of an animal encounter. Further, a bear, for instance, wouldn't carefully unplug a phone or remove bedding to cover its tracks. That's just not what bears do, since they aren't worried about covering up their transgressions or whether a jury will convict them for a crime. In the months and years following 2006, as the case remained unsolved, Alberta's Forestry Department took concrete steps to improve safety and security at all fire lookout towers. Where once lookout sites were relatively open, they're now secured with locked gates and perimeter fences to keep intruders out. Notably, the signs directing tourists to these lookouts were removed, making them harder to find. The occupants of these fire lookouts have also been advised not to let in any guests, and to essentially treat any visitor as potentially hostile. To this end, the cabins themselves were retrofitted with stronger steel doors, shatterproof glass windows, and improved locks. Notably, brush and trees around each site were cleared to eliminate hiding spots and give workers a clear line of sight when someone approaches. At present, no trace of Stephanie Stewart has ever turned up, and her case remains a chilling national park mystery. It takes less than 5 minutes for a family's world to shatter. To put this in perspective, this is less time than it takes to boil a kettle of water or to give Freebird a listen. In that brief window, a perfect June afternoon can curdle into a nightmare, and a beloved child can step behind a bush and drop off the face of the earth. For the Martin family, that window opened and closed on June 14, 1969, in the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. What followed was not just the frantic search for a missing boy, but a story of chaos, heartbreak, and an unexpected legacy that would change the science of saving lives forever. This is the story of Dennis Martin, the vanished boy who would capture the nation's attention. For the Martin family of Knoxville, Tennessee, the annual Father's Day weekend camping trip was a cherished tradition. In June 1969, William Martin led the familiar expedition, bringing his 2 sons, 9-year-old Douglas and 6-year-old Dennis, along with his own father, Clyde. For Dennis, who was just 6 days shy of his 7th birthday, this was his first time along on this trip. The first day went as planned, and the family hiked from Cades Cove to Russell Field, camping for the night before continuing their journey on Saturday, June 14th. Their destination was Spence Field, a beautiful highland meadow nestled along the Appalachian Trail, known for its stunning views. There they met up with another family, and the afternoon unfolded in the idyllic way of such outings, with the adults relaxing and the children playing. Sometime after lunch, the boys hatched a plan. In a fit of youthful excitement, they decided to play a prank on the adults by splitting up hiding in the dense foliage that bordered the meadow and jumping out to surprise them. William Martin watched with amusement as the children whispered and plotted. Because Dennis was wearing a bright red t-shirt, the older boys worried he'd be too easy to spot, so they sent him off in a different direction to hide by himself. It was a seemingly innocent decision, and in any other moment it would have been a minor and forgotten detail in a children's game. But that red shirt, which should have been a beacon of visibility, would instead become an icon of an impenetrable mystery. At approximately 4:30 that afternoon, the mousetrap was sprung. The older boys leaped from their hiding places with shouts and laughter, but Dennis didn't appear. His father, William, had seen him go behind a bush just moments before, and at first there was no alarm. But as the seconds ticked by, a knot of unease began to form, and time began to move slowly. William would later estimate that 5 minutes passed, and initial concern turned into full-blown panic. He began calling his son's name, his voice cutting through the mountain air, but there was no answer. William immediately began a frantic search, running down the trail for nearly 2 miles, convinced his small son couldn't have gone any farther. The other adults joined in, scouring the nearby woods, but absolutely nothing was found. As dusk began to settle over the mountains, the family's nightmare was compounded by a new, formidable adversary: the weather. A severe thunderstorm rolled in with terrifying speed, unleashing a biblical deluge which caused streams to develop into raging torrents. Temperatures dropped to unseasonable lows, only about a dozen degrees off freezing. The storm was more than just bad luck. It was a catastrophic event that acted as an accomplice to the disappearance. It systematically erased the few clues that might have existed, washing away footprints, obliterating any scent for search dogs, and ensuring the scene was wiped clean. The official search for Dennis Martin began at 5 the next morning, Sunday, June 15th. What started with a crew of 30 National Park Service personnel rapidly escalated into the largest search and rescue operation in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The numbers were staggering, and within a day, the force grew to 240 people. By Dennis's 7th birthday on June 20th, nearly 800 people were combing the mountainside. The effort peaked on June 21st, with an astonishing 1,400 searchers involved. The call for help had been answered by a diverse and dedicated coalition. There were park rangers, local rescue squads from several states, scout troops, college students, firefighters, and even 40 elite Green Berets from Fort Bragg. The story captivated the nation, with President Richard Nixon reportedly monitoring the situation from the White House. Notably, this massive search effort actually had more in common with a disorganized posse than with what we presently think of when we think of search and rescue. At the time, the National Park Service had no detailed, pre-existing search and rescue doctrines. The prevailing philosophy was called surround and drown, where you just take as big a wave of people and sniffer dogs as possible and deluge the area. This surround and drown approach proved to be a catastrophic mistake. The massive, uncoordinated wave of well-intentioned but largely inexperienced volunteers descended on the area, inadvertently destroying the very evidence they were there to find. Potential footprints were trampled, scents that may have still existed were contaminated, and delicate clues like broken twigs were obliterated. The paradox is disturbing. The immense public desire to help did more to hurt the efforts than anything else. The search was officially scaled back on June 26th, largely abandoned by June 29th, and formally closed on September 14th, 1969. The deluge of men and women had receded, leaving the mountain just as silent as it was the moment Dennis disappeared. In the vacuum left by the failed search, theories began to grow. With no body, no clothing, and no concrete evidence, the disappearance of Dennis Martin became a case on which people projected their wildest fears. The most straightforward and officially accepted theory is that Dennis simply wandered off, became disoriented, and perished from exposure or an accident. The area is known for its incessant winds that can easily drown out a small child's cries. While there's no direct evidence to support this claim, this is the official stance of the authorities. The Great Smoky Mountains are home to a variety of wildlife, including black bears and feral pigs, leading to speculation that Dennis was attacked and carried off. Some reports from the time noted that a drought the previous year had made animals bolder and hungrier than usual. However, wildlife experts and many investigators were skeptical of this theory. A predatory attack on a human by a black bear is exceedingly rare, and an event violent enough to carry away a child would almost certainly have left behind some evidence. Still, this theory hasn't been entirely dismissed and is theoretically possible. From the beginning, Dennis's father, William Martin, believed his son was kidnapped. This theory hinges on a single and deeply problematic piece of testimony. On the afternoon Dennis vanished, a tourist named Harold Key and his family were in the park, miles from Spence Field. They reported hearing a loud scream, and then shortly thereafter, they witnessed a rough-looking man advancing through the woods. For investigators, it was a highly unreliable lead. The sighting occurred around 5 trail miles from the disappearance site, a significant distance for someone to carry a child in a short amount of time through rough terrain. Further, there are no direct trails connecting the two locations, meaning that this man would have had to have taken Dennis through the woods directly. The absolute lack of resolution in the Dennis Martin case created a perfect environment for regional legends to attach themselves to the story. Generally, I don't mention these sort of theories for cases such as this, but here there appears to be a significant amount of people who advocate for this theory. For generations, local folklore has included tales of feral people living in the wilderness. Inevitably, the story of the lost boy became intertwined with these legends, with some speculating he was taken by such a group. Notably, Harold Key's description of an unkempt and shaggy man is cited as evidence by people who believe this theory. More than 50 years later, the fate of Dennis Martin remains one of the Great Smoky Mountains' most profound and enduring mysteries. The forest has kept its secret, and it's virtually impossible that we will ever know for certain what happened in those brief minutes at Spence Field. For now, Dennis Martin's case remains yet another haunting, unsolved national park enigma.